you really gain confidence that this is true and authoritative and amazing. So just occasionally going deep helps you to, it prevents you from being tossed to and fro. Like the next time somebody says, you know what scholars say, you know, you have seen some of the areas that where people could be confused on issues, because it sometimes does get complicated, and the only way to figure that out is just exactly what you would do when you're trying to figure out the problem with your pain in the side. You gotta take the deep dive to figure out, is this a gallbladder problem, or is this cancer, or is this, what do I have? And that's when you really try to figure out, can I solve this by having vitamin B shots, or do I need surgery, you know? And when you wanna own the truth and not just take what I want to hear, but I want to know the truth, whatever it is, so that I can have the best way forward. And that's, I think, what we need to do here, because we're dealing with ultimate issues. Ultimate issues. Is this true or not? There are a lot of worldviews. A lot of people say it's baloney.
Well, a lot of us have been taught by people we love and who love us, and they've taught us things that maybe aren't as true as, you know, the second look. And I think it's difficult for people to just automatically discount.
Oh, that is such a great point, because, you know, think about the unintended sort of, I lean emotionally towards this perspective, because this is the comfortable thinking. This is where I was raised. This is the view I was, and I was taught this by my parents or my pastor, who I love dearly. And so there's that. Sometimes that's not even something you articulate. It's just, but there are 100 different positions on whatever topic we're doing, and they can't all be right, even though they all have loving pastors and parents. That's why you have to sometimes be skeptical of your own views. Skeptical in the good sense, the healthy sense, where you're asking questions. Is this the right way to look at it? What are my blinders? Have I been duped? Have I distorted it? Is it distorted because of the way that my contemporary culture distorts the text? What did the ancients think of it? You know, these are the kinds of questions I encourage on my podcast and in the things I write. This lecture, the final lecture, is on the resurrection accounts and whether or not we can sort of harmonize them. There are some differences in the way these narratives work together. They are sometimes challenging, just like we saw with the day of the crucifixion. And so the attempt here is to harmonize them in so that they can make sense as a part of the historical narrative, rather than just as like Hansel and Gretel. These aren't just mythological stories, they actually make sense in a regular flow of times. First, let's start with the challenges. John 20, verse 1 says, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said, 'They have taken away the Lord and out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him.'" So the question here is, how many women are at the tomb? Here it seems like Mary Magdalene arrives, and then she runs to the disciples. But Luke 24 says it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and other women who told these things to the apostles. So which version of the story is right? Is it Mary alone, or is it Mary with the other women? How do you typically resolve these? Yes?
Well, in the last line of the John paragraph there, it says, "And we do not know where they have laid him," not, "and I don't know where they have laid him."
That's a very good observation that people have pointed out. Where's my pen? I'll highlight that. Top paragraph, bottom line. We do not know where they have laid him. So she's obviously indicating, so this is what happens a lot. You have spotlighting, and it's common in the ancient world where you highlight one character without sort of indicating that they're by themselves. You're simply highlighting this one person And it's a literary device, literary spotlighting. So it's obviously following Mary, but it's not saying Mary is all by herself. So that's a good point to make. So here is a very good piece of information from a guy named Thomas Starkey, who taught, I think, at Harvard, or very influential. He wrote a classic book in 1833 called The Practical Treatise of the Laws of Evidence. And he observes it, quote, "It has been well remarked by a great observer that the usual character of human testimony is substantial truth under circumstantial variety. It so rarely happens that witnesses of the same transaction perfectly and entirely agree in all points connected with it, and that an entire and complete coincidence in every particular engenders suspicion." So if everything looks exactly the same, it actually engenders suspicion. It looks like they're telling the story. Whenever you may have seen this on a detective show, like witness A, witness B, witness C say the same thing, and they're starting to scratch their head. It seems really like they're not just telling the same story, but they're using the exact same words. That's suspicious. But when you have different perspectives, often this is the case with eyewitness testimony, what he says here is the usual character of human testimony is substantial truth under circumstantial variety. There are various things that differ, but the heart of it is the same. The gist is the same. I don't know if you've ever seen any of these like YouTube videos where you'll have it's a classroom, like first day of law school, and they'll have these something going on where the professor is starting to give a talk, and then all of a sudden somebody comes in like protesting, "Ah!" And it causes a commotion. People are looking at the commotion, and then all of a sudden like somebody comes up and says, "You can't do that," and it causes this big controversy, and then the professor stops and says, "Okay, this was just a fake protest. It was fake, all to distract you guys." And they're like scratching their head, what is he doing? And then he'll say, "And I filmed it. Did you guys catch the gorilla?" And they're like, "What are you talking about?" And then on the video, there's a gorilla walking by. They didn't see the gorilla because they were distracted from that with the commotion. And that's the challenge often for eyewitness testimony. How reliable is eyewitness testimony after all? Well, here's where the Gospels have a very, very strong advantage. The Gospels are not like a report of something that we saw in the corner of our eye, or may not have seen. These were the reliable witnesses who were his followers, who went with him everywhere and who heard his sayings over and over again. They were with him from the beginning. This is what Jesus says: "You who have been with me from the beginning will proclaim these things." He says that in John 15. "You who have been with me from the beginning." And that from the beginning language is also what we find in Acts when they're appointing a new apostle. We're going to appoint somebody who's been with us from the beginning. It's almost like those two things fit like a hand in my glove. One's from Luke and one's from John. And so what we have in the Gospels is eyewitness testimony of the reliable things that Jesus said and he did. But when we look at them, we see substantial agreement with various differences. And sometimes those differences are hard to put together. And I'm going to argue in this lecture, this is a very good thing. It's a very good thing that they're difficult to harmonize, because it's a mark of truth. Amen. It's a mark of its historical truth. Though it sometimes causes people to have questions and to doubt. In the long run, especially when you know this kind of thing, the people who have worked in the world of criminal investigation, creating laws, evaluating evidence and reliability, this is a good mark of the historicity of the resurrection accounts. Stylistic differences in reporting, important to note here. While John's narrative certainly highlights the role of Mary, he nowhere states that she was alone. Matthew says that another Mary happened to be there. Mark indicates this Mary was the mother of James and Salome. In Luke's version, Mary Magdalene was there with Mary, the mother of James, but also Joanna and other women. So, how many was there? Was there one? Were there two? Were there maybe up to five? Well, it's all about what each narrator chooses to highlight and spotlight and how they want to tell the story. You can't tell the whole story because sometimes the whole story is complicated. And what you get are some gospel writers telling the gist of the story, simplifying the story, giving you the main details of the story, and others giving you a little bit more, telling you a little bit more, giving you a little bit more of the whole account. And sometimes those are hard to put together. And as one of our attendees here said, the we is significant. We don't know where we have. So this does seem to indicate that the gospel writer here, John, is spotlighting Mary's role, but she was not actually alone. Okay, now, can these reports be harmonized? Here's where it gets a little more tricky. Matthew 28 tells us that toward the dawn of the first day of the week, toward the dawn, is that before sunrise, toward the dawn? Mary Magdalene and the other women, other Mary, went to see the tomb, and behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. The angel then tells the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, as he said. Come, see the place where he lay? Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead, and behold, he is going before you to Galilee." So they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. This is the part where Mark's gospel actually ends. The short version is, there's a long version of, actually there's a long and a short, which we'll look at. But I believe the authentic part that we have ends here. Matthew's part continues though. And behold, Jesus met them, the women, as they're on the way, saying, "Greetings." And they came and took hold of his feet, and they worshiped him. Okay, so the women in Matthew's version go to the tomb. There are multiple women. They go to the tomb, and they see the stone roll back, and then an angel tells them, Jesus is not here, he's risen from the dead. As they leave, then they see Jesus, and he tells them, "Greetings." So they see Jesus. Now, look at John's version. Mary finds the empty tomb, and then she runs to tell Peter and the beloved disciple, quote, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb. We do not know where they have laid him." In other words, Mary isn't filled with joy. She is completely distraught and fails to mention A, the angelic announcement, B, the fact that Jesus appeared to the women. How do we fit these together? Seems like if she had seen an angel announcing something, she would report that. She's going to the disciples saying, "The body's missing. We don't know where they put him." Why does she say that? The angel told you that he's risen, and Jesus told you that he's alive. What do you mean you don't know where they put him? How do we possibly put these together?
Two events.
Oh, I was about ready to say we should just, maybe try the Quran, because this is duplicative. That's, I think, a better hypothesis. Two different events. So let's explore this hypothesis. What if there was a lot of activity that's condensed into a single easy narrative, like the women go to the tomb and then they go to the disciples, that's condensed differently. But what if it's 5 or 6 different times? Think about this. Number one, first question. Okay, let me put on my trench coat and my cigar. So I'm Columbo for a little bit. So let me ask you a question. I got a question. Do they have wristwatches in the first century? Like, a whole bunch of women are going to meet at the tomb. Is it going to be exactly at 8 o'clock in the morning, at 6 o'clock in the morning? Or are they going to come in waves? Like, how do you know what time to get up exactly? Right? So you're going to get up early, but are you going to get there exactly at the right time? It's easy for us to get there right around the same time, but they don't have alarm clocks. So what if the women come in waves, and so Mary gets there ahead of some of the others, sees it empty, and then goes distraught, tells the disciples, while others get there and see something different. Okay, but now it's all told in a way, but Mary does come back and does join them at one point and see something that it's complicated to tell that story, especially if there's a bunch of times when they're coming and going. It's hard to summarize it, so they just simplified it into a simple narrative that's not wrong, but it just gets the gist. And some people's gists differ from other people's gists. This happens when I tell my wife something that happened, and then she said, yeah, but your friend said X happened. And then I said, oh, yeah, that happened too. I just neglected to tell you that part. So here's what really happened. Because I summarized it differently. That kind of stuff happens. What time is it? Does anybody really know what time it is? Does anybody even care? Matthew 28. Now, after the Sabbath, toward the dawn, okay, Mark says, when it was very early on the Sabbath, on the day of the week, when the sun had risen. Luke 24. On the first day of the week at early dawn. Early dawn, that sounds like the sun had risen. John 20. On the first day of the week, when Mary Magdalene came while it was still dark. This could be an indication that Mary does come there alone, at least initially, while it's still dark before the other ladies come at dawn after the sunrise. So just play with that hypothesis. One thing you should be very skeptical of is your own hypotheses. Sometimes I will throw out a hypothesis to my wife, and she'll say, "Nah, give it a week. You'll skip it next week." And she's right. I give up on the hypothesis. I played with it a while, and I was like, "No, it doesn't work." Other times, I will say, "What do you think about this?" And she'll say, "That's interesting," and I'll explore it. And yeah, it becomes more of a foundation. Like this makes sense of more of the texts. So as we look at all the passages and we think about this idea of the gist, there is something called narrative compression, in which everything is sort of compressed that distorts time in a certain sense, because it's the way we're telling the story. And again, this is the way you tell any story. If you're going to tell a friend or your spouse about what happened at the mall, this crazy thing, this protest that came through and people were shouting and suddenly it broke into a fight, you're going to compress the time because you're not going to tell it in real time. Telling everything, you're going to tell the highlights. All right? Narrative compression. So here is a good example of narrative compression. Look at this is the way Luke 24 works. The first 12 verses, women witness the empty tomb and they hear the angel report. They relate this to the apostles, and all but Peter dismiss it as an idle tale, which is weird that you would find this story of the women being the first witnesses, because the whole idea of it being dismissed as an idle tale is a very strong first century Jewish male custom. Women weren't even allowed to be witnesses in a court of law. They were thought to be, not reliable in that first century culture. We have references to that effect in Josephus. So it's weird that the Gospels actually do include this. There are some ancient non-Christians who ridicule this. Like, who was it that reports this? It's a few women, It's weird. Okay, so then verses 13 through 49, Luke then talks about two disciples on the road to Emmaus. And these disciples return to Jerusalem and relate to the 11 what they witnessed. They were told that Jesus had also appeared to Peter, and then suddenly Jesus stood among them and began to speaking to them about the things written about him that had to be fulfilled. This, by the way, is the fact that Jesus appeared to Peter is mentioned in 1 Corinthians. Mm-hmm. It's weird that it's not mentioned in any of the Gospels. I have a theory that the short ending of Mark was a scroll that got, over time, it ripped off. And so it ended abruptly. But that Mark's version, since it's Mark is Peter's translator, would have reported that. And I'm hoping and praying one day we find a copy that has that story. Wouldn't that be an awesome story, news story? That has the full ending of Mark, the actual authentic version. And I'll try to give you some evidence that the versions that we do have of Mark's ending are not authentic, but they are early summaries of what happened. And so here, Jesus appears to Peter, and he begins speaking to them, the disciples, about all things written about him had to be fulfilled. Takes you up to verse 49. Starting in verse 50, When Jesus finished speaking, we're simply told that he led them out as far as Bethany, and then lifting up his hands, he blessed them. While he blessed them, he departed from them and was carried up into heaven, and they worshiped him. If you're just reading Luke's gospel, you think Jesus ascended into heaven on Easter Sunday. Is that true? Did Jesus ascend to heaven on Easter Sunday? What else happened? There's 40 days. Who says that? It's Acts, the book of Acts, written by Luke. So Luke is a guy, he's obviously, in the book of Acts, he's giving you a hint that he compressed the narrative here at the end. It doesn't say, and then many days transpired, and then he was, he's speaking in there, and then all of a sudden, and Jesus was taken up, he led them out to Bethany. That's the kind of thing that the beginning of the book of Acts helps us to see the compression. It's the same author who's now expanding, okay, that which was compressed, I'm going to expand out here so that you have a better idea that there was more time. You mentioned the 40 days. Once you know that can be a thing, that can help you in other areas. Maybe the problem is one narrative here is compressing and the other is expanded, and that these are hard to fit together. And the angel according to Matthew. Okay, so in Matthew's account, after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, went to see the tomb, and behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and rolled back the stone and sat on it. This angel's appearance was like lightning, and his clothing was white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. Question, were there guards there when the ladies got to the tomb? When the ladies got to the tomb, there's no mention of guards. So, and it's also when the ladies get to the tomb is open and they go in and they see an angel inside the temple. But here in Matthew's account, there's a reference to an angel sitting on top of the tomb immediately after it's open, and the angel sits on top of it, and there are guards still around. So is this an earlier scene? And is it a scene, like how do we know that the angel was sitting on top of the tomb? Maybe that's like a report of one of the guards who then became a believer and told that story, and then it got spread in the early community and finally written down by Matthew. I don't know. I do think it's interesting that this isn't the account. No other gospel has an angel sitting on top of the rolled stone. But the angel says to the women, the angel singular says, do not be afraid. And Jesus is not here, he is risen. Go tell the disciples. Alrighty, Matthew and Luke's version of the events. The women were saying to another, who will roll away the stone from the entrance? And then they finally get there. They look up and they see the stone has been rolled back. Notice they don't say an angel sitting on top of it. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right, dressed in a white robe. They saw a young man. So Mark's version sees one angel in the tomb. Luke's version, they find the stone rolled away. And while they were perplexed, they saw two men standing by them in dazzling apparel, and they were frightened. So this seems to be at a time in which there is an angel or two angels. How do we make sense of this? Is it one? Is it two? Is it a contradiction? There's at least two. Yeah. One could be spotlighting. We've already seen that. Spotlighting, they're just talking about the angel who spoke, but doesn't mean he's by himself. It could be that there are two different times. So this one happened 37 minutes before this one. And it's, again, waves of women coming in and with slightly different experiences each time they come in. What did the angel say? Okay, so I don't know if it's dark, if it's bright enough in here for you to see the colors. I tried to do some color coding. So there's blue here, blue here, blue here. And this is the Matthew account, Mark account, Luke account. And when you see the red, it's a similar thing. And the green, let's see, can you see green? Is that green? I can't even tell if that's green. I'm here. That's maybe orange. There's some green. I'll do it this way, okay? And he said is in green. All right. So the angel says to the woman, do not be afraid. That do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus is the same kind of thing you see here. Jesus, who was crucified. And you seek Jesus. You seek. And he said, he told you. So there are these patterns. A lot of things are repeating the blue part. He is not here. He is not here. He is risen. Come see the place where he lay. Come see the place where he lay. In Luke's account, that Luke's account doesn't have the come see where he lay. He does have the he is not here and he told you and what are you seeking. So there are similarities between all the accounts of some of the crucial details, but it works together in the way Thomas Starkey was talking about the laws of evidence. There's substantial agreement with a lot of variety in terms of the circumstances. Substantial agreement with circumstantial variety. And I don't know, when I was a younger Christian, these kind of things bugged me. Then when I finally began to realize, okay, that's actually a sign of truth, it sort of kind of made sense, but not really. And the older I've gotten, the more it's like I've completely changed camps. This is sort of hard to digest when you want the Bible to be neat and clean. It's got to be not contradictory at all. And this is kind of hard to put together, but it actually is in the Bible's favor because this is written in a way from different perspectives that is the way you get reports when people are reporting important events. And that is the key takeaway. Yeah.
It's interesting they highlight Peter, tell his disciples and Peter. I'm just wondering if some of these people were in two different places. It seems like Peter and John are together, and maybe they're in Jerusalem, and then the others maybe are in Bethany, where they were staying that week.
Yeah,
maybe some of it is just.
I do think that there is I think probably what happens is there was a scene in Acts where all the disciples are meeting in the upper room, the same place where they had the Last Supper, and it was a Jerusalem place that was spacious. And I think it's probably my theory is the house of the beloved disciple, and I connect the beloved disciple to a different apostle than John. And so but I think it's John the elder, not John the apostle. So it's a Jerusalem disciple, and he's got the wealthy place. That's why he had the seat of honor where he's next to Jesus. And I think that a lot of them were still staying there because it's like you got a whole bunch of these these Galilean fishermen, Galilean disciples. They need a place to stay when in Jerusalem, and he's got a spacious place, and so they're all staying there. When a couple of different reports will say that Mary, like one of them says, Luke's account says, she goes and she says these things. They, plural, dismissed it as an idle tale. But Peter went off to check these things. It doesn't mention John because there's a tendency to keep John kind of on low profile, and which fits with my view of protective anonymity. John's gospel finally is willing to reveal, but not naming himself, revealing the beloved disciple, and he goes with Peter. But you have the same language of they went and these things were dismissed, but those two are the ones that went to check it out because they were at least curious. Let's at least question. That's what we need to do, is at least be curious enough to question and to investigate. Unpacking the sequence of events. All right, so let's think about the sequence here. Sometime in the middle of the night, an angel rolls back the stone and sits on top of the stone, and this frightens the guard. The angel did not sit there all morning long. Okay, just a hypothesis. Mary Magdalene, number 2. Mary Magdalene with another Mary, and possibly others, were the first to arrive at the tomb while it was still dark. Or maybe Mary by herself, and then she comes back later with others. 3, finding it empty, Mary, likely by herself, goes and runs to tell the 11. And as she left, more women began to arrive, perhaps in waves, and encountered a variety of different angelic appearances. Eventually, they all left the tomb to tell others what they had seen, and according to Matthew 28, Jesus appeared to them. Possibly here, they are the ones, so Mary leaves, it goes to tell them, but the other waves of women come and see angels, and they say, go and tell the disciples. They go, they see Jesus, not Mary. Mary comes back to the tomb. John's gospel records her having an encounter with Jesus at the tomb. So maybe in this case, Mary, though she was one of the ladies to arrive at the tomb, she wasn't one that saw Jesus on the road on the way out. Unless that particular way out was the scene John is reporting. Again, there are different ways to put this together. Maybe the scene in which all the women see is because Mary isn't by herself there in John's version. Again, it's all about compressing the narrative and then trying to figure out, okay, if we try to make it match up, what's the best hypothesis to make it work? When Mary arrives where the 11 were staying, she was distraught and only reports the missing body, since that's all she knew at the time. That seems to be pretty clear. Peter and John run to the tomb. When they arrive, they find it empty. Mary heads back to the tomb soon after this. And once Peter and John leave, she encounters two angels and then Jesus himself. According to John 20:18, she goes back a second time and says to the disciples, "I've seen the Lord." John's gospel is the only one that has a little bit of that extra bit. You know, she goes to the tomb, she goes to the disciples. She goes to the tomb, she goes back to the disciples. Okay? It's the only one that does that. So what I'm suggesting is the gospel, most of the gospels only have the one trip. John tells us there's at least two. What if there were different waves of this happening with different women in each wave? And that could explain, I think, all the possible conflicts. So, summaries. In Luke chapter 24, we find Cleopas, who was one of the two named disciples on the road to Emmaus. By the way, church tradition says Cleopas was Joseph's brother. Joseph, the father of Jesus, adopted father. Cleopas is his brother. So he's Jesus' uncle. That's what tradition says. You never heard that? I told him something new. Anybody else has anyone else heard that, by the way? It's new for everybody.
I know he wrote Hebrews. Cleopas wrote Hebrews, that's what I heard.
I haven't heard that. You just made that up. By the way, it's the same name as Cleopatra, but it's the masculine form. Something else you probably didn't know. So Cleopatra is not an Egyptian name, it's a Greek name, because she was a Greek queen. Did you know that? Mm-hmm. She was descended from the Ptolemies, they were Greeks. Mm-hmm. Alexander the Great. You saw Philip's grave. Greeks. A lot of people think that she's Egyptian. She's not Egyptian, she's Greek. All right, Cleopas, yeah. He is possibly according to, again, church history, he's and he, I think one of the Gospels mentions that Mary, the wife of Cleopas, or Salome, the wife of Cleopas, something like that. So some of the people, the ladies at the tomb, one of them may have been married to Cleopas. So he was there with all of this. And anyway, so some of our women amazed us, it says. They were at the tomb early in the morning. When they did not find his body, they came back saying that they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. So he may have been there. Let's just say they're all meeting in the upper room. He sees the women come saying they saw a vision of angels. Well, this isn't the earliest reporting when Mary is only seeing an empty tomb. This is one of the waves, or maybe the second wave, and he's only reporting that part. A vision of angels who said that he was alive. In this scene, we're not told about their appearance of Jesus later. So again, if it happened at different stages, it's all being compressed into a narrative that makes it seem like it's contradicting, but it isn't necessarily contradicting. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb. This is the report about Peter and John, but this one doesn't mention John. And found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. Now, in verses 33 through 34, the two disciples returned to Jerusalem where the other disciples report that the Lord had appeared to Simon shortly after this Jesus appears in their midst. So that is the information we get from Luke 24 and the two men on the road to Emmaus. Now, in 1 Corinthians 15, we're told specifically Christ died for our sins, was buried, was raised, and he appeared to Cephas and the 12. That is it confirms it's two different accounts. And this particular account is not denied by atheist scholars. This is the earliest account of the resurrection that we have because it's the oral, memorized creed. That creed, that he would die for our sins, and that he appeared to Peter, goes back to the time before Paul became a Christian. Atheists, agnostics, and Muslim scholars agree. This is the consensus in New Testament scholarship, no matter if you're conservative or not. There are some who are atheists, Durabilism is one of them, who says they certainly experienced something that they interpreted as the resurrection. So they had an experience of something, and this was before Paul's conversion. So within a couple of years, they memorized this creed, and they experienced something before that. Now, short ending of Mark. This one you may not be familiar with. This is the version that is not in our Bibles, but it is in some of the early manuscripts. Not early, I should say. Probably 3rd century. But it's one of the alternative endings of Mark. And it ends this way after verse 9. But they reported briefly to Peter and those with him all that they had been told. And after this, Jesus himself appeared to them and said, and sent out by means of them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Okay, so they reported briefly to Peter all that had been told, and then Jesus appeared to them, and then, boom, we wrap this up. In other words, it's like a way to explain the missing ending of Mark. It's just a very short, and then the play's over. Boom, the end. It's very short, and it's hugely compressing the narrative, right? It's just, it didn't make sense that the Gospel of Mark ended in such a brief way. The long ending of Mark, you guys are familiar with, because it goes into much more detail. And it says, so the first 2 verses before the ending, go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. And they went out and fled the tomb. For trembling and astonishment, he had seized them, and they had said nothing to anyone, and they were afraid. So I was watching like a PBS documentary once. It was sort of by all these liberal New Testament scholars, and surprise, they didn't interview a single conservative. And it was saying how the long ending of Mark is the earliest gospel, and when you look, the long ending of Mark is not authentic, and surprise, surprise, it ends before it gets to the resurrection scene. And it had my daughter at the time, who was just a high school student at the time, was looking at this like, is that true? And I paused the screen, and it had a section of Mark's gospel. And it was highlighting the part where the real ending starts. And I said, just look at this. You go up a couple lines, and here the angel is saying, he is not here. He is raised from the dead. The angel is announcing it. And these people on this TV show are trying to tell you that Mark's gospel didn't teach a resurrection. It's silly. It's nonsense. And then I tried to talk to her about what most conservative New Testament scholars have argued is that the long ending of Mark is another one of these places where people were trying to summarize the thing because it didn't seem right to end here with the women being afraid. Here's what verses 9 through 14 say. When he arose early on the morning of the first week, on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene. That's kind of the language you get from the John story. Who he first had cast out 7 demons. That's the language we get from Luke's version. So she went out and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept. But when they heard that he was alive, she went out and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept that he appeared. Okay, so she is relating an appearance. And when they heard he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. This is reporting here from these sections. But it could be getting that a little bit like this is one of those places where it's summarizing things that may, did she, in those texts, does she actually report the resurrection? In the John scene, she's just reporting that it's an empty tomb. After these things appeared in another form of 2 of them as they were walking in the country, Jesus appeared to 2 of them in another form. So this is the story of the road to Emmaus. And they went back and they told the rest, but they did not believe them. So this is also the ending of Luke. And afterward, he appeared to the 11. That's also the ending of Luke. And they were reclining at a table, and Jesus appears to them and rebukes them because they did not believe. So this is all seems to be summary material using bits from other gospels to explain the ending of Mark, and it goes on from there. But the point is on the resurrection there. This is the part that it's relating. This material is not in the earliest copies. The earliest copies, the very earliest copies, they don't have this material at all. It ends there at verse 9. And there's some, I think there's some really good indications that that this material is not authentic for a host of reasons. If you have any questions about it, we can talk about it. But I think the best hypothesis to explain this version is that it's trying to harmonize, it's trying to explain why Mark's gospel ends this way. I think it would make much better sense if Mark ended with the story of Jesus' appearance to Peter. And the fact that Mark would end it here doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I am optimistic that it is sort of a something on hold that will be discovered someday, and we'll find somewhere a manuscript of Mark in that will shock the world. That's what I hope would happen. Hopeful, prayerful. That if there are any documents that need to be still yet discovered, may they be found in our day. Questions, comments?
Found in a mummy.
Found in an ossuary or a mummy. Yes, sir.
I know you're good at this.
That you can stop there.
So, let me get this straight. So the disciples are hiding or waiting where when the women go to the...
I believe they're in Jerusalem at the site of the upper room, which is the place they had the Last Supper, because that was the John the Elder's house. It was the Jerusalem disciple, the beloved disciple, and that's where they're hanging out. They seem to be there in the book of Acts. When Peter comes, he's at the gate. Remember, it's a gated home. It's a wealthy home. Okay, it's a gated home, and it's big enough to have all these disciples. Most Jerusalem houses, you can't fit more than, there aren't sleeping quarters for...
Why does he steal a donkey from a guy he knows?
Steal the donkey?
Yeah.
Oh, when he takes the donkey?
Yeah.
I think he set that up already in advance. He says, go. There's a prearranged meeting when it talks about the house for preparing the Passover. There's also a prearranged thing. He had talked to somebody about the donkey, and he got permission. And so when he tells the disciples, go to a certain house, he's actually giving them directions to get a specific donkey. You already have to do prearranged thing about it.
All right, so that's why I say you're good at these things. Okay. So you're telling me that from Jerusalem, they are running to the top of Mount Olives, then they come back, and then they run back to the top of Mount Olives, and then they come back. That's pretty wild.
I don't think it's a Sabbath-based journey. It's only 15 stadia. So if you think of a single stadia, the length of the stadium. So it's 15 of those. So walking and running, yeah, that's one of the reasons it's complicated, because it takes time to walk that distance. And John's gospel mentions the running, and then John got there ahead of time.
Peter pooped out.
So in other words, it's something like that took a little bit of labor, and it was worth noting that if you look at the Gospels, there's this fascinating thing that John's Gospel in particular, John, the beloved disciple, and Peter are often compared with each other in such a way that the beloved disciple comes out a little bit more preeminent. And I think it's because Peter is the most important disciple in terms of John says so, upon this rock I'll build my church. So he's got the reputation in the early part of the church being the rock, the foundation guy, the head honcho. And so John, seeking to show he's been more the behind the scenes guy, but he's just got the credibility to write a gospel. He's showing that he was before Peter in the very beginning of the gospel. He's showing that he got to the tomb earlier. He's got the same kind of gravitas as Peter with a little bit more. He was the first to recognize Jesus as the Messiah, the resurrected Messiah in John 21. Over and over again, when the two are compared, John comes out a little bit ahead. So he gets there to the tomb ahead in John chapter 20, and he sees it. He doesn't go in. Peter goes in. Maybe the reason he doesn't go in is because it's now the Sabbath. No, it's Sunday now. So, but it was still the Feast of Weeks, Feast of Unleavened Bread, and so he would be unclean. And he is, I think, more the priestly line, so he's more hesitant. Peter's like, just, I'm going in. And then he's like, okay, well, let's just go in together. Yes.
Well, I was in Israel this time last year. I went with the Tim Wildman with the American Family Association,
Okay.
a large group, and we went to all these sacred sites.
Yep.
And Tim Wildman, you know, he wasn't the one on the bus saying, "Look at this, look at." I'm going to tell you all about. These were people that were trained and had to pass tests about, you know, what the sites were and the
Yep. significance
of them. And our guide was from the Holy Land. He wasn't Jewish, he wasn't Muslim, but he was he knew the Bible real well. And we went to the top of the Mount of Olives in our bus and got out and took a group picture with the Temple Mount behind us. And probably everybody gets. I'm sure you've been there.
I have not been there yet.
You've never been there?
Not yet.
Well, the
I was
temple.
planning on going this year. We got some problems with, I think, news stories.
October.
So,
Yeah.
well, the Mount of Olives is huge.
Yeah.
It's on
Right.
the foothills
Yeah.
of the Appalachian Mountains. And on top of the Mount of Olives, there's a lot of Muslim
Yeah.
communities, schools and everything like that. But our guide, like I say, he had to undergo a lot of examinations to be an authentic tour guide. Never mentioned anything about the Mount of Olives being the place where Jesus was crucified. So we went to the church of the
Ascension?
Holy Sepulchre.
of the Holy Sepulchre. And the story there was Queen Helena, the
Yep.
mother of Constantine,
Yep.
went to Jerusalem to discover the sites that she read about in the Bible. And the Christians there at the time, in the 300s, said that this was where Jesus was crucified
Right.
and buried. And they built a church over it.
And some of it was related to somebody who had a vision. The vision revealed where it was, and she believed that the person who had a vision. So it gets really speculative.
There was a church there, and when the Romans, after they conquered Jerusalem in 70 AD, one of the emperors built a pagan temple
Right.
over the site.
Yeah.
And so that was significant because they wanted to cover up, the evidence that Jesus was actually there. And this was all told Queen Helena, and she took some artifacts back. It was supposed to be like a part of the cross and all that. That could be controversial. It seems to me like it would be very hard to discount the fact that she went there and was informed by the Christians who had been living in the
Yeah.
area since the time of Jesus. This is the place right here.
Yeah. But it's
We
300
saw
years.
the rock where his body was laid out.
Still, it's 300 years later, so it's further back to us, to George Washington. And a lot of mythology, I mean, did George Washington chop down the cherry tree? Did he
Well,
have
there
wooden
was
teeth?
nothing told us about Jesus dying on the top of the Mount of Olives, and there wasn't any. That subject wasn't brought up.
But
I
it
never
does-
heard about it until.
Right,
I'm
but-
not discounting what you're saying.
What I'm saying is the name Golgotha was assumed to have been the district at the top, and it would have made sense to them. Nobody would have needed to say the Mount of Olives, because they said Golgotha, and everybody at that time knew that that was the district, the summit, the peak. Everybody knew that was the Mount of Olives. That's my theory. And the problem with the Church of the Sepulchre, which is behind the temple this way, is that all the Jewish sources have it being east of the temple. The place of execution is east, so it's this way, not this way, not north. The two possible locations, one is here and one is over here. They're not east. The execution place was east. The execution place was by the place where the sacrifice of the red heifer, which was right here at the top of the Mount of Olives. David Roll, the guy I interviewed on one of my episodes, he has the same view, and he says, if you go to the Church of the Ascension, which is right here, you'll find in their garden is a tomb. It's a first century tomb with a rolling stone, and nobody visits it. And it should be investigated as the possible tomb of Jesus. And that's something that I want to do when I take a tour to Israel. I want to go to the Church of the Ascension. I want to look in their garden and check out that tomb and see what kind of reports have been done about that. Because I do think it's a better fit, partly because, again, when you look at the language of I think it's the book of Mark, the person at the top sees the temple curtain ripping. You can't see the temple curtain ripping from over here or over here. It doesn't work. He is seeing and responding to that. It's also all the language about the eastern gates, all the gates for where the court of the Sanhedrin met, there was one here, one here, one here. And they're all looking for the execution victims this direction. They wouldn't be able to see this direction. It's too big of a massive temple complex. They wouldn't be able to see that direction. They would be looking in this direction for the execution victim who goes. So Golgotha, to us, sounds, we just have the resonances sound like skull. But to them, I argue, it communicated the top of the Mount of Olives.
Well, we were taken to like Gordon's tomb.
Yeah,
And
which is this area over here.
right, and we saw a rock outcropping, like called the place of the skull.
Right.
And they had a photograph of it with the light on it just right. It did look like
Yeah,
a
yes.
skull.
But the thing is, that's Gordon's Calvary, which is discovered in the 1850s or so. Nobody before then had ever reported that there was a place that looked like a skull. And again, it's to this side, so this is not the place east where they would take victims for execution, and it wouldn't be a place you can see the temple curtain roofing. It just doesn't fit all the pieces of the puzzle.
Well, I'm just having I don't know.
Yes, yes, yeah, exactly. That's what happens. That's what happens with everything, especially if it's become a paradigm. After a while, the paradigm does the thinking for you, and you say this doesn't make sense because ... Which is why all the scientists said Einstein is crazy. It doesn't make sense according to our current assumptions, but the problem is with your assumptions, not Einstein's theories.
So what you had this up, the curtain, the Babylon curtain?
Yeah.
So that was the first I'd heard of that. And so it caused me to just think about, I looked at the ripping of the curtain as at the death of Christ, that we have access to the Holy of Holies by the death of Christ, as Christ is our high priest. And wanted to know, like, the Babylon curtain, I don't know, like, what was the symbolism of that?
Yeah.
What I just described, just
I do think
approach to,
it could be like that has become a very standard thing. Like when Christ dies, there's a theological significance to the curtain ripping. We think of it like our access to the, I think other passages can get us there. In fact, the book of Hebrews talks about the curtain of his flesh being torn. So look at chapter 8 and chapter 9 of Hebrews, and he talks about that. That last part of the tabernacle being symbolic for the present age, and it's a new time of reformation would come. It's basically a new covenant transition to the old covenant. And so Jesus' death is ratification of the new covenant. And I think that it's, though the one that actually tears in the Gospels is not the inner chamber. So I think that's part of because we assumed that it was the one for the Holy of Holies. We built a theology that was connected with that assumption. But I don't think there are any specific texts that actually say that. It's built on our assumptions of what happened.
yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. But with that curtain, what was the purpose of it? Do you have any clue?
For the purpose of the curtain in front of the temple,
Yes.
there's another text that mentions it too. It's an intertestamental text called the Letter of Aristeas. And it talks about how it was such a beautiful sight, how the curtain in front of the temple blew in the wind and shimmered. You see I think they even changed the curtain depending on the festival. So for this particular feast, they're going to put the purple up, and that's sort of, this is the curtain that we put up. Here's the standard curtain, but here's the Feast of Weeks curtain. Here's the tabernacle curtain. So it's kind of like decorative. And you see that decorative, it's a liturgical calendar kind of thing. You see that the emphasis on the beauty of the temple, even with the apostles, are looking from the Mount of Olives, looking at the temple, saying, look how beautiful these stones are, and how the decorations. And Jesus then, who is the temple incarnate, says, not a stone is going to be left upon one another. It's not the outward beauty. It's internally, it's like whitewashed tombs. It's the whole story, just like the Pharisees were whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but dead bones inside. This whole thing is going away. And what remains is the God who came to Jerusalem, just like was prophesied in the prophets. He will come to his temple, and he is the one who is the true beauty, but his beauty is seen here, giving his life in love for his people. And that's the true beauty of the story. It's not like any jewel. No treasure compares. Yes. Yes.
Oh, There is a YouTube video, a 3D rendering of the temple put out by a Jewish group, and it flies through all the courts, and it does show that big giant curtain
Really?
outside.
Okay, I'm not
Yes.
pick your brain.
But
I've never
I
seen.
think that there might be a distinction of careful Bible reading of whether the curtain was seen ripping or it was reported ripping, and that's kind of where I'm at a little bit right now.
Mark's gospel seems to say that the centurion sees that, that's the only thing he has. He sees that happen with the expiration of Jesus, and that's why he says, surely this was the Son of God. Now, I think what he does is, Mark's account is combining earthquake and the cause of the earthquake causes the temple. Matthew spells that out. So, but Mark has chosen to highlight the temple curtain, which I think was caused by the earthquake. But in highlighting that, I think he's saying that's what he saw that made him say this is the Son of God.
But, so from this one, do you know if the camps would have been, you said we're talking about 3 camps.
I do, yeah.
So where would the 3rd camp?
So in the Old Testament, there were 3 camps. And it was the tabernacle, which is the house of Yahweh, and then the Levite camp, which camped around the tabernacle, and then the tribes of Israel camped around that. So you have all the 12 tribes in different parts of the camp. And so this would be the house of Yahweh. This would be the camp of the Levites. So that's why you can't go into that court if you're ritually impure. The Levitical temple soldiers would keep you from entering in. And then the camp of what the Dead Sea Scrolls say, a lot of them did say there are 3 camps, and it just gets kept complicated. So I didn't highlight any of those. But it's the city of Jerusalem, and the city of Jerusalem ends somewhere over here, so right outside the city limits. So you cross the Kidron, somewhere in here. Sometimes they talk about like the Bethpage area. The priests lived in this Bethpage area because they had to be within that Sabbath day journey so that they could go to the temple on the Sabbath and without violating the law. So right around here, somewhere in here, is the dividing line. So basically Jesus is just outside the limits of Jerusalem, and I'm not sure whether that road is the right way to do it, but basically, somewhere there's an official city line, and some of the texts do actually talk about that. Right there, as somewhere on the Mount of Olives, is that line into the city of Jerusalem where the bridge begins and stuff.
But my point is though, wouldn't some of those other churches which they claim to have Christ have been still in that 3rd camp? If that's the case, then it couldn't have been the location.
I'm not sure. Say that.
So like the Church of the Sepulchre, right?
Oh, okay.
And,
It's way off that map.
Okay.
okay, so I didn't know like where those were, just curious.
Sorry, it's not the scale.
Oh, okay.
It's somewhere out this way.
It's close
Yeah,
enough
actually,
to
here's
mark
the old city line. So this old city line is supposed to be right outside that old city line.
You see right there in the black?
This is it?
No, up higher. Right, up there.
Yeah, Tomb of Jesus. Okay, yeah. See, here's the old city line. Here's the new city line. So it was right out to the old city line. And so if you go to this other map here, this other illustration, you see what is,
From the west.
this is looking toward the Mount of Olives will be over here. So this would be behind, and city wall here, outside the city wall.
Okay.
Look at that illustration right there. There's a wall in between the big courts. You see that little low, long pony wall? Go under the temple courts, up there, right to your left, in the courts. Get in the courts. And now come towards yourself here. Go there. You see that wall right there?
Yeah,
That is where no Gentile can go.
the wall of separation. Yeah. And there's a death threat. We actually have copies of this in Greek. And, no Gentile can pass through this section without, the death penalty. He would be responsible for his own death, I think is what it says. I actually argue that Josephus calls these rooms houses. There are meeting rooms in here. And he calls them houses and oikos. And that's where it says they were meeting on in Acts chapter 2. They were meeting in one of the houses. And then it says he spoke, and then 3,000 were converted. Well, The only place in Jerusalem where you could speak and have 3,000 converted is if it was in one of these houses. And that, to me, makes better sense of the Acts chapter 2 setting. He's actually in one of the houses, because they were frequently meeting in the rooms of the temple or the Solomon portico. But anyway, here is the real challenge for the traditional view. Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it's just this relationship, the tomb of Joseph and the cross. It's that doesn't ring true. That doesn't seem like a good fit on a whole bunch of reasons. Number one, it's behind the temple. You can't see the temple curtain ripping. Number two, it's not the place of execution, according to every ancient text we can see. Number three, Joseph of Arimathea, a very rich, wealthy man, wouldn't have put a tomb there.
Well, it was outside the city wall.
It is outside the city wall. It qualifies on that one point, yes. But it's also not necessarily on a main pathway. Think about this. The people who saw the sign that John says specifically, they saw the sign, they read the sign actually. And so they have to be pretty close. If you're out in the middle of nowhere, even if there's a pathway right here, let's just say there's a path right here. It's a, it's like, can you read the sign? If it's right next to a public road, that would make more sense to me in a big district area where there's in a common public area. And this to me is like a little out of the way. So there's just so many different ways it doesn't really work. And harmonizing all the different biblical details is looking at the details, trying to see if they fit. That's when you discover this is real history. It does really fit. And it fits in unexpected ways where we should take our own views, our own perspectives, challenge them with facts and see what best fits the facts instead of what best confirms my biases, what confirms my tradition, what confirms Kent's views. You don't want to go there. Sorry.
Well, there are a lot of traditions, the stations of the cross, and we saw, every one of those stations, but, according to your view, this is all just.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of tradition. The more you understand tradition, the more you see there's a lot of different tradition, and they can't all be true.
Yeah.
And the biggest tradition, Good Friday, I don't think it makes sense of the day. I think it conflicts with the biblical narrative, as we've seen. Same with some of this. I don't think the traditional view of Golgotha makes sense. I think the fact that 1 Samuel 15 has David going up the ascent of Golgotha, you know what happens as he goes to the ascent of the Mount of Olives? It says where he's the summit, the Rosh, and that where God was worshipped, it was a worship spot too. And there he then goes a little further beyond and he gets 2 donkeys and then he keeps going on. It's almost the exact reverse of what happens with Jesus. He comes in on Palm Sunday, he gets 2 donkeys and he goes down the Mount of Olives. And David has committed a grave sin and he has to get a clemency so that he can be pardoned by the King of the universe. But there are still earthly consequences. Part of it is the kingdom will be ripped into 2. But ultimately, the thing that allowed for his own pardon was the death of not his immediate son, but his ultimate son, the Messiah, who would take that same line, ascending and carrying the wood up to the top of the Mount of Olives and bearing his sin and ours. And that just connects with a lot of motifs of the text. Yes,
weeping.
Charles. Yeah.
Where was it that Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac?
So here's the thing about the sacrifice of Isaac. It says in Genesis that go to one of the hills of Moriah. It doesn't specify which one. One of the hills. So Moriah in those days is a district. And Moriah was later specified as the Temple Mount was built on Mount Moriah. By that time, in the time of King David, it had become one Temple Mount among, I think, 7 other hills. And the other, so the information that we get there, David specifies this place because he sees the angel of the Lord there, standing between heaven and earth. The angel of the Lord is in that Genesis 22 passage too. And there's a lot of interesting parallels. There's a There's one case, a man with a knife in his hand who is stopped, and the other, it's a sword in the hand that is told to cease. And there's just, as you study the parallels between why that Temple Mount was chosen and the Genesis 22 passage, amazing parallels. Well, in this case, it's one specific mountain that became the Temple Mount, where the angel was standing. And that is, with the Jewish perspective, the Jewish tradition is, this is the place that Isaac was almost sacrificed. We don't actually know that. All we know is that Abraham was coming from Hebron from the south, and he comes up and he would have seen both hills, but one of them had been revealed to him. So we don't know which hill he was actually on. Was he on the Temple Mount? Was that revealed to him? Or was he on the top of the Mount of Olives? We don't know. It could be that he was on the Temple Mount, and that it's significant because this is where the ultimate place of sacrifice is, all the animal sacrifices. And that won't do. This whole place looks over here. The whole temple sacrifice isn't enough, and it's waiting for the ultimate sacrifice up here on the mountain. Or when he came, maybe he was here on the top of the Mount of Olives, and that's where the possible sacrifice was, and it's why the angel says, on this mountain it shall be revealed. Or maybe he comes to the Mount of Olives and sees no, he wouldn't be coming from the south. He wouldn't come to the Mount of Olives. You got to know your geography to make it make sense. Hermeneutics is about knowing your geography, knowing your customs, knowing your history, knowing language and how to interpret poetry. It incorporates all these. And the people who are better equipped with all these tools are the people who have been doing it the longest, are the people you should rely on. If you're going to go study Shakespeare, you should study under a person who's read it throughout the course of his life, teaching a class of, not just people who are starting to read it for the first time. You're probably going to pick up more if the guy has read Shakespeare in the context of 16th century poetry and prose, where 16th century, where you actually find, like, here's what this archaic English word means. In this day, it had this kind of resonance. That's the kind of thing that I think helps the Bible become alive, and it gives you confidence that it's true. All right, any other final thoughts, questions? Yes, sir.
Going back to the first talk, there was the idea that the dead person is watched over, that's in the tomb. I'm just wondering if, because I've read that the Jewish people didn't think that the person was really dead until like that third day.
Most of the dead.
Mostly, okay. But then like after that, then there's like this decay period. So John, in the Lazarus account, he makes a point to note that it's the fourth day and they have to roll the stone away. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering if like this secret meeting where they decide to guard the tomb and put a stone in front of it, that wasn't a usual thing. Like they would wait a few days before they would actually roll this stone in front of the tomb, to kind of watch over and, like you were saying, make sure the person is really dead.
That's when they immediately died. Someone would have to stay with the body, but after they were put in the grave, then that was it. They were laid down there to go.
Stone in front of all that.
Yeah.
It would take more than one person to roll the stone.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly not something a couple women are going to do. It's very, these are heavy. Even the small ones are heavy, and you can't just easily move them. It takes work. And that's what we find is the language is consistent throughout all the gospel narratives. Think about the language you mentioned, stooping in. This is consistent with the kind of rolling stones that we find in the first century archaeology. That they do have rolling stones. You do have to stoop in, and we find them in the general area. We find them in all over the place in the Mount of Olives. That was the place, the expectation. You can see today when you look on a Google Maps of Mount of Olives, covered with tombs. Mm-hmm. So very, very significant place for a wealthy Jewish aristocrat to have a tomb in his own private garden.
Well, these are tombs you're talking about on the Mount of Olives. They're not in a cave. They're like the tombs you
Well, you
see in
can't-
New Orleans. They're
Yeah.
above the ground.
But I'm just still saying that the reason you see those there is because it's a very significant mountain. And
Oh, yeah.
same would be the case for the cave tombs, and we have found a few of them on the Mount of Olives. There's a question back here? Yes.
The upper room, is there, if that's associated with Caiaphas' house, is there any archaeological evidence where that would be located?
You think the upper room is associated with Caiaphas' house?
Maybe I've got that wrong.
So I do think that the beloved disciple somehow is known to the high priest. You find that language in John 18.
Yes.
He's known to the high priest, and so there could be some kind of relationship. That word known there is the same word that you find in Luke's account when Jesus is 12 and he goes to the temple. He's going with those who are blood relatives and those who are known. In other words, close family members, intimate. So John could be related or very close relationship to Caiaphas, which could mean, in my view, he's actually, so that ossuary is interesting, which says Joanna, daughter of Jehohanan, son of Theophilus, the high priest. There is a Jehohanan, a John, who is the son of Theophilus, and Theophilus was a high priest. John, we didn't know this Jehohanan existed until the ossuary. We knew of Theophilus, Josephus writes about him. And we knew that Josephus had a son who became high priest. Matthias was his name, and he was the last reigning high priest before the destruction of the temple. If John is the John who writes Revelation in the gospel, he's the high priest that I think he is, he would have been high priest, the last high priest. And a lot of times when you look at the prophets in the Old Testament, they were priests, like Ezekiel. They were priests. So what if like his name was erased from the record? Because like that's what you do when you have somebody who, you're dead to me, you know? You don't write their history. I do think there's some similarities between the language we find of Caiaphas' house. He has a gated home, and in the upper room is a gated home too. It's a wealthy aristocratic home. And all the Gospels, when they talk about this, they kind of have it in this clandestine way, right? Go to the center of the city. When you see a guy with a pot on his head, tell him, hey, where's the house we're going to go? He's going to lead you there. It's one of the servants who's going to lead you to this clandestine place with no mention of a name. Why? I think it's protected anonymity. They're protecting the source. All those guys were protecting the source of John because he was tricky in those days, which is a good indication that the Synoptic Gospels are early, written at a time when he still needed protecting. John is finally in Ephesus later, and there's a little bit of time and land difference, and he can now write a little bit more about his role, but he's still keeping his name out of the record.
They know that Judas is a betrayer at that point, and
Yeah.
it could be they also all find out together. In other words, if Judas knows where they're about to head to, he could, let me go buy some stuff for the feast, and then he shows up at the Roman cohort, and ruin the dinner plans. In other words, he's finding out at the same time where this house
Right.
is, along with the other disciples.
Yeah, but that guy had a little bit of power and authority as a member of the ruling class, where he was kind of protected anyway, because he was just, you don't arrest a police officer kind of thing. There's a question back here.
Yeah, in one of the Gospels, you know which one it was, where Peter and John go look in and they see the clothes, but they see it
John 20.
on the shelf where they lay Jesus to the right.
Yeah.
In,
Very specific.
Yeah, my wife and I got to go to Israel in April of 2018, and they were talking about that most of the tombs, the shelf where you were laid after you were dead, was in the straight in back. And they said there was only 7 tombs at that point in time that they ever uncovered that the shelf was to the right. And we had gotten to go to see the one at the garden too.
Yeah.
And that was quite interesting. But so have they found a tomb where you go in and the shelf will be at the right?
I don't know the answer to that. That's something that I will have to keep in the back of my head as I go try to get Dr. Roll to do a tour of the one at the garden at the Church of the Ascension. I'd love to do a documentary about the whole subject.
I did have a photograph of one where there was places to put bodies on the left and the right.
One of the things that he mentioned was that the face napkin and then the linen things seem to be distinct both in our understanding of Jewish culture, but also in terms of the reporting that we find in the Gospels. And I saw a documentary once that showed that there is, in addition to the Shroud of Turin, there is another piece of linen that is reported to be the face cloth of Jesus that has some bloodstains. I forget the name. It's got a obscure name.
Veronica?
No. But this particular piece of cloth has bloodstains on it. And the documentary lined up some of the bloodstains on the Shroud of Turin with this particular face cloth. And it looked pretty good to me. So I need to do some more investigation on that. I still haven't made up my mind about the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of information in there that goes one way and the other.
Yeah.
One of these days I want to do a show on it. And at this stage, I'm still kind of like, sometimes I think, gosh, it seems authentic. Gosh, I don't know, it's too complicated. But that is one thing that puts me in its favor, that the stain looks pretty similar on both cloths. Any final thoughts, questions? You got one more chance to stump me. Stump the speaker. How can we put X and Y together? Simply just X and Y, you squish it becomes C.
So Jesus is not a Passover lamb sacrifice, he's a red heifer sacrifice?
Actually, he's everything. Jesus is the Passover lamb. He's the scapegoat. Actually, if you think about the scapegoat, so he's the red heifer. He is the true temple. He's the living water. He's the Passover manna. All these themes find in what Jesus says. You seek the scriptures, thinking in them you have eternal life, but these are the texts that speak of me. He's being demonstrated again and again in so many different ways, right? The scapegoat is interesting. I think the scapegoat passage kind of points us back from the time of Leviticus to the Cain and Abel story, where you have like the original couple was sent out of the garden, but not out of Eden. Cain was sent out of Eden. He goes east of Eden. But so they're in this area just outside the garden, and they're still corresponding with Yahweh, making sacrifices, and God speaking to Cain. And they're outside the eastern side where the cherubims with the flaming sword barring them into the area with the tree of life. But they're having sacrifices. And one is accepted, one is not. It's basically now like the temple where you have the sacrifices just outside the gate of the temple complex where God's presence is, right? So you think about Cain and Abel, you have one who is left alive. One of the brothers is left alive. The other is sent away. One is slain, and the other sent away. So the whole idea of the scapegoat seems to be kind of echoing that. And then when you get to the time of Jesus, something similar happens. So the scapegoat is kind of looking back and forward. Jesus is the one who is slain, and yet this other Jesus, a guy named Barabbas, his first name is Jesus. This is not known, except for in one text in Matthew's gospel. There's a variant that a lot of English translations are now including it because it's a very reliable variant. And it seems like they took it out. It got taken out because it was too confusing. Which Jesus are we talking about? It's Jesus Barabbas, and this Barabbas is sent away. So you have two Jesuses. One of them is slain, and the other is sent away. And so what you have in the rituals of Israel are all these kind of symbols that echo things in the past that then become the full resonance moving forward. Does that make sense?
Sure. You're always exiled to the east.
Always to the east, yeah.
Do you have anything from the scriptures about a person being on the right, a person being on the left, and one of them seems to convert, and the other one is
Yes, there's a story about that in the Gospels when Jesus is crucified.
No, I'm saying, is that a portrait of something that we should hold?
I don't know. Can you think of anything?
Well, it just seems to be that Jesus is the one in the middle who brings you access to the Father.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I like that.
Well, he does say, Jesus does say that, you know, family will be against family.
Right.
Two will be out in the field, one will be taken, and one will stay, sort of thing. And so that sort of imagery.
And you do have the language of the thief on the cross who initially seems to complain about Jesus. If you're both of them, the language says, we're ridiculing him. But then by the end, it's a long ordeal. He's like, remember me when you go into your kingdom. It seems like this is a point that a lot of the critical New Testament scholars end up saying, okay, these don't line up. And I think if it's a long ordeal and he sees some of these amazing things like earthquakes and and things ripping, perhaps that is more plausible because he has indications of darkness coming on the land. He is, the more he sees, like this is an unusual person. Maybe he is beginning to think about this being the Messiah.
Was the kingdom of God and the kingdom of heaven the same?
The kingdom of God is the language that Jesus uses for the gospel in its first early stage because the king is here. The kingdom is wherever the king is. And the king is there at the, repent and believe the gospel of the kingdom. This is the early language. How can you preach the gospel in these early days? How can you? Because the gospel is death, burial, and resurrection. Well, the good news is the fulfillment of the Davidic promise in those days. The king who was promised, the good news of the king who was promised throughout the centuries is here in your midst. Although it's not here in its fullness because the king hasn't accomplished everything he's come to do. So the gospel of the kingdom is just the kingdom that was promised to David. Here is the everlasting king. He's finally here, which makes it even more confusing that the kingdom seems to come to a screeching halt when the king is killed. And there's but this is why Jesus had to keep saying, wasn't it written? It was written. Haven't you read? Have you not read? This is one of the most important questions Jesus asked all of us. Have you not read? He asked this question over and over again. Now, I just recently had an email correspondence with T. David Gordon, who is a fantastic author, written a lot of interesting books, but he said something fascinating I never thought of. He says, I'm a media ecologist. I taught a class on this. He says, in the ancient world, they had very few books because they were expensive and it was hard to write. They were copied by hand. So what people did is they had some books, a few books, or access to books that they knew very well. They read them well. Today we have many books and we read them once. And so what I would challenge you is to think about that idea. The ancient Jews knew this book very well, rereading. And it's that continual rereading when you see the connections between Genesis 22 and 1 Chronicles and the story of Jesus that makes it all come alive. It's through the rereadings and those where the connections become really significant. And then you see this is not a human book. This is a divine text. All right, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.